What happens when a president decides that justice is no longer about laws but about enemies? History told us it could never happen again. After Watergate, after Richard Nixon's enemies list, Congress promised the country that no president would ever get away with turning prosecutors into political hitmen. And yet here we are, facing a crisis that looks eerily familiar, only this time it may be even worse. Because while Nixon only dreamed of using the Justice Department as a weapon, today we're told it has already been wielded that way. The alarm bells are ringing, and ignoring them could cost us the very foundation of democracy.
Another issue I want to raise relates to the administration, and you have to go back in history to appreciate it. Richard Nixon. Students of history, of course, know that name. Former Vice President of the United States, former Senator, he was a senator and a congressman, Vice President under President Eisenhower, and then President of the United States. He went through a period we know as Watergate. It was controversial. Some people broke into the Democratic National Headquarters. They were caught. They were prosecuted. When it was all over, we had the Watergate investigation, and ultimately President Nixon resigned. But before he resigned, he instructed his staff to give him background information on his enemies list, the people that he considered to be his political enemies. And the word was out that they were going to be treated harshly by his administration, whether it's Department of Justice or the Internal Revenue Service. Well, we went through that chapter, he resigned, and then Congress came together, Democrats and Republicans, and said, we can never let this happen again. We can't let a president put his finger on somebody and say, that's a political enemy, go prosecute him. Try to find them guilty of a crime, make sure they pay a fine, give them bad publicity. We agreed on a bipartisan basis for standards between the White House, the Department of Justice, and Congress when it came to these political decisions that could ultimately result in prosecution. Well, under President Trump, we're back into the Nixon conversation about enemies list, except President Trump's enemies list is longer than anything Richard Nixon ever dreamed of. And that's what we're looking at now. On September 20th, the acting U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, Eric Seibert, announced his resignation. Acting U.S. Attorney, appointed by Trump, resigned. Mr. Seibert resisted President Trump's demands to bring charges without sufficient evidence against New York Attorney General Letitia James and former FBI Director James Comey. Mr. Seibert, a Republican appointed by Donald Trump just a few weeks ago, stayed true to his oath to the Constitution and his commitment to follow the facts and the law. And for that, he was forced to resign his office. In his place, President Trump installed his personal attorney, an attorney with no experience as a prosecutor, never did it before, to indict James Comey in a politically motivated case considered by career prosecutors in that office too weak to bring charges. This indictment represents the latest step in President Trump's long crusade to weaponize the federal government against his perceived political enemies, a return to the days of Richard Nixon. We remember when the president was initially impeached in the first of his historic 2 impeachments after he attempted to pressure a foreign ally to dig up dirt against Joe Biden and his family. And we remember when President Trump turned a mob of insurrectionists loose on our Capitol, where they violently attempted to prevent the peaceful transfer of power leading to his second impeachment. I will never forget that day as long as I live, January 6th. It has been my honor to serve in this chamber 29 years. I've seen a lot. I'm honored to represent a great state like Illinois, but I will never forget that moment when we were sitting here counting the Electoral College votes as to what the American people had decided on the next president. Vice President Pence was presiding. We were seated in our chairs. I noticed something unusual. Those 2 doors opened, and 4 or 5 people walked in up to the vice president and literally yanked him out of his chair and took him out the door. We knew there was a political demonstration outside, but all of a sudden it turned bad and scary and dangerous. The Capitol Police came in and announced to us, seated in this chamber, stay in your desks. We're going to make this a safe chamber in the Capitol. Don't worry about those people demonstrating outside. They're not going to get close to the chamber. Just stay where you are. We looked at one another and thought, what's next? Well, what was next was 10 minutes later, the same policeman came in and said, leave immediately. Don't take anything with you, just get out of the chamber. It's too dangerous for you to stay here. And we all, Democrats and Republicans, filed out those doors. You know what happened next. The insurrectionists took over this building. It was one of the most embarrassing moments in the history of the United States Capitol building. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, if you heard the news that the House of Commons in Parliament had its door broken down and people raided the chamber. You'd say to yourself, what is going on in England, for goodness sakes? The House of Commons taken over by people in the street? That is exactly what happened here. And it happened on January 6th. And so this president, embarrassed by that moment, maybe, who knows if he's ever embarrassed, decided he would go after the people who prosecuted the insurrectionists, the people who were prosecuted for crimes like beating up policemen. You all came here today and we welcome you to this chamber. The reason you're safe in this building today is a lot of women and men in uniform who are guarding you and me and all of our staff so that we can do the people's business. Those people were under attack by the January 6th insurrectionists. These were not curious tourists who came in here. They ended up beating on these police, and 140 of them were seriously injured. If you believe it, in this second administration, the president has gone further than Richard Nixon and what he's done before. His political appointees have fired FBI agents and federal prosecutors who were called on to prosecute the insurrectionists. He has installed loyalists whose chief qualification is their loyalty to him, not their loyalty to the law or the Constitution. We recently learned a top federal prosecutor in Sacramento was fired after she advised the Border Patrol to comply with a court order. Yes, the Trump administration fired a career prosecutor for following a court order. Never in the history of our country has a president so brazenly demanded the baseless prosecution of his rivals, and he doesn't even try to conceal it or hide it. He glories in this constitutional outrage. In a social media post, President Trump issued a command to Attorney General Bondi, and I quote, "They impeached me twice and indicted me 5 times over nothing. Justice must be served now. We can't delay any longer." He's referring to the prosecution of James Comey. Imagine that, a sitting president commanding his attorney general to prosecute state and federal officials who simply tried to uphold the rule of law. That's exactly what this president is doing. What Richard Nixon was stopped from doing, he is doing. Since Watergate, Republican and Democratic presidents alike respect the independence of the Justice Department, recognizing that shielding it from the pull of politics was essential to safeguarding the rule of law. Under President Trump, those constitutional guardrails have been removed, destroyed. I want to be clear. What you're seeing from the Trump White House is not normal. This just isn't some inside the Beltway drama. If the president can turn the Department of Justice and the FBI into his own personal police force to target his political enemies, he can just as easily turn it against ordinary Americans. And the dam is already starting to break. The president sent active duty forces into Los Angeles earlier this year to put down protest of his administration's cruel immigration raids. He threatened to make war on the city of Chicago, which I'm honored to represent, by sending forces into that city as well as Memphis, Tennessee, and has now ordered the military to Portland with authorization to use, quote, full force in Portland, Oregon. The governor of Oregon, the mayor of Portland said what the president said about being at war and unlivable is just plain wrong, and yet he does it. It's a slippery slope into authoritarianism. Once DOJ and our military have been politicized, there are few guardrails left. So while today it's Letitia James and James Comey who are the targets, tomorrow it could be our fellow citizens who dare to even criticize the policies of the Trump regime. That is the risk we face and the danger that lies ahead in this perilous moment. That's why I've opened an investigation calling for answers from Attorney General Bondi, including making available several Trump-installed loyalists for questioning. The American people deserve to know if the chief law enforcement agency of the United States is following.
It started with a simple test of loyalty. An acting U.S. attorney named Eric Seibert, a Republican, and someone appointed by the president himself, was told to bring charges against political rivals, not because the evidence was strong, but because loyalty demanded it. He resisted. He stayed true to his oath, reminding everyone that the law isn't a toy for politicians. For that act of integrity he was pushed out, forced to resign. And the message was clear in this system: loyalty to the leader outweighs loyalty to the Constitution. That's how the slope into authoritarianism always begins. Someone says no and suddenly they're gone. In his place came something new, something dangerous. Not an experienced prosecutor, not a career attorney with decades of knowledge in how to handle cases. Instead, a personal loyalist, someone who had never led a prosecution in their life, was handed the keys to one of the most powerful offices in the country. Their first task wasn't to uphold the law or protect the public. It was to target James Comey, the former FBI director, in a case that career prosecutors inside that office had already dismissed as too weak to stand. But weakness didn't matter. What mattered was loyalty. Competence could be discarded, because loyalty alone was now the currency of power. That appointment wasn't an accident, it was a strategy that stretched back years. Remember, this wasn't the first time the justice system had been bent to personal will. When the president was impeached for the first time, it was for trying to coerce a foreign ally to investigate a political opponent's family. That was the earliest warning shot. And when impeachment came again, it was tied to one of the darkest days in modern American history, January 6th. But instead of being humbled by those events, the response was to double down, to replace independence with obedience, to purge those who followed the law instead of personal commands. On that day in January, Senator Dick Durbin was inside the chamber when everything turned upside down. He remembered watching Vice President Mike Pence pulled out of his seat by security. He recalled the Capitol Police telling lawmakers they would be safe, only to return minutes later and order an evacuation. And then, as senators filed out, the rioters poured in. It wasn't tourists wandering through the halls. It was an angry mob, breaking windows, beating officers, and overwhelming the very people tasked with defending democracy. More than 140 officers were left injured. And still, after all of that, the instinct wasn't to protect justice, but to twist it against those who stood up to the chaos. Because what followed was retaliation. Federal prosecutors who insisted on following court orders were fired. Career FBI agents who wouldn't bend to political pressure were replaced. Even city leaders found themselves threatened with military force. In Los Angeles, active duty troops were deployed to suppress protests. In Chicago, threats of war against the city were made openly, and in Portland, federal agents were sent in with authorization to use full force. The governor of Oregon and the mayor of Portland both pushed back, calling it wrong, but the show of power had already been made. This wasn't about protecting public safety. It was about showing who was in charge, even if it meant turning American streets into battlefields. That's why Durbin's words hit like a siren. He wasn't just recounting history. He was warning of the future. He reminded the Senate of Watergate, not as a history lesson but as a comparison. Back then, Nixon's attempts to weaponize justice were stopped because both parties drew the line. Democrats and Republicans agreed together that the Justice Department must remain independent. They knew the risk of allowing political vendettas to dictate prosecutions, and they said loudly and clearly, never again. But Durbin's point was chilling. That line has been crossed again. And this time the silence from one side is deafening, because this isn't just about a handful of high-profile names like Letitia James or James Comey. It's about a principle that protects everyone. If prosecutors can be ordered to pursue baseless charges against political enemies, what's to stop the same machinery from being turned against journalists, against judges, against ordinary citizens who dare to speak out? Once the guardrails are removed, there's nothing left to stop the slide. Today it's about silencing rivals. Tomorrow it could be about silencing anyone. That's the danger of replacing expertise with loyalty. When prosecutors are chosen not for their qualifications but for their willingness to obey, the justice system stops serving the people and starts serving one man. That's not democracy, it's authoritarianism in disguise. And the scariest part is how quietly it can happen. One resignation here, one firing there, one loyalist appointed in the shadows. No single moment feels like the collapse. But when you step back, you realize the system isn't the same anymore. Justice has become conditional, truth has become negotiable, and democracy has begun to corrode from within. Durbin described it as a code red alarm for democracy. And he's right, because the threat isn't hidden, it's open, brazen and celebrated. Social media posts command the Attorney General to act like a personal enforcer. Federal agencies are turned inward, not outward, aiming at critics instead of criminals. And through it all, the question hangs in the air: is there even one senator who will put country before party? One leader willing to say enough is enough? Or are we content to watch the foundations of democracy erode until nothing is left to protect? The truth is that democracies rarely collapse in one dramatic moment. They fall apart piece by piece, one abused power at a time, one silenced critic at a time, until suddenly what was unthinkable has become the new normal. That's why this isn't just another Washington drama. It's not just about one attorney general or one president. It's about the kind of nation we want to be. Do we still believe in the independence of justice? Do we still believe that no one is above the law? Or have we decided that power is reason enough to bend the rules? Because if justice can be weaponized against political rivals today, it can be weaponized against you tomorrow. And that's why this moment matters. That's why history is screaming at us to pay attention. Nixon tried it, and the system fought back. But now the system itself is under siege. And unless there's the courage to stand up, to defend the rule of law regardless of politics, we may look back one day and realize that democracy didn't die in a single explosion. It died slowly, quietly, in silence. If you believe the rule of law should never be for sale, if you believe democracy has to be defended every single day, then don't look away. Stay informed. Speak out. And if you want to keep shining a light where others prefer darkness, subscribe to this channel. Because democracy doesn't die in one dramatic moment, it dies when good people stay silent. Don't let that silence be you.